Welcome to Exceptional Journeys, an enriching podcast tailored for families and caregivers of neurodivergent individuals.
I'm Georgia Mueller.
I'm Nicole Schroeder.
And I'm Karen Tennyson. All right. Welcome back to our podcast. This week, we're going to talk a little bit more, kind of continue our discussion. We've talked about in previous podcasts about how to get a diagnosis, why to get a diagnosis, and how to access different therapies. This week, we're going to continue our discussion with talking about special education. So I want to hand this off to Georgia. Can you talk a little bit about the different options for special education at like the different ages?
Sure. So the opportunities to interface with our state school systems start as early as birth, actually. And that goes from 0 to the age of 3, and it's called Part C of the IDEA laws. And after that, then we transition into Part A, which starts at the age of 3 and continues up until somebody turns 21. So you've got it pretty well covered from 0 to 21. I think this is really important because what happens a lot of times is people will say to me, well, I know something's going on, but I can't get any help yet because I don't have a diagnosis. And my answer is, no, that's not true. Please don't wait. Don't wait till you have a diagnosis. Just go straight to either your school district, if your kiddo is already 3, or if they're not 3 yet, then you can check in with your state organization called your PTI, which is a Parent Training and Information Center. Every single state has at least one Parent Training and Information Center. And a lot of their job is to actually teach you about your general rights as a parent in the special education process. And there are many documents that will spell this out that are super boring. So if you need a good sleep, go ahead and pick yourself up a copy of your state's procedural safeguards and read them. But they're very exacting and they're very specific, and they're giving you, very specific recommendations and rules that the school is supposed to follow, but also your opportunities and rights if you disagree with something that's going on. And so I definitely recommend everybody read that. All the states are also required to offer what's called a Parent Bill of Rights now. And these different rules and regulations exist at every level of the special education process. And so it's very important that you know what your rights are in all of these different arenas. And there's other little acronyms. Boy, there are so many acronyms in this field.
So many.
Yeah, so many. I'm not going to define them all, but I'm going to give you a couple to be on the lookout for. And one of them is called FAPE, which is Free and Appropriate Public Education. And that means that your education that your child is receiving needs to give them as much access to the general education as the programs that our general education students without disabilities are using. So they are to mirror each other. Free and appropriate public education. Another one is everybody has rights under the Office for Civil Rights if they have a disability or they're supporting and advocating for somebody who does have a disability. And this is really important because not everybody understands what their responsibilities are in supporting our kids, and sometimes they do it wrong, and sometimes they need to be corrected. And if we don't have anybody to hold them accountable, then what do all these laws mean if we can't hold people accountable?
Right.
So know about Office for Civil Rights and understand that you have the right to file complaints and things like that if you need to. And that's kind of equivalent to Americans with Disabilities Act, like you would see in an employment setting, but this is in the educational setting, and it's called Office for Civil Rights. The other thing is families always have access to all of their children's identifiable records that are generated by the school system or any other system that's serving them with state funds. And that's FERPA, Family Education Rights and Privacy Act. And this is, it's very comprehensive. Literally anything that is personally identifiable to your student.
So does this include like any assessments that the school did? Things
Absolutely.
Like that? Okay.
Yes, that's the important thing.
Yeah.
Because you never know how important that information might end up being like a year or 2 down the road.
Right.
And you want to say, but this has been going on the whole time and nobody noticed. Oh, but look back at these records from a year or 2 ago when we evaluated last, and we actually can see that evidence. So it's personally identifiable. That may mean, too, that we receive things like copies of the assessment sheets, not just the outcomes themselves. And that can be reevaluated by another assessor and could change the outcomes for what your child should be receiving. So always have access to records and don't be afraid to ask for them. Do it in writing. Everything in writing, that's the other thing. As a general advocate, always everything in writing, and these days that means email as much as anything. Just don't neglect to ask for things in writing. Don't just do it verbally and passing in the hallway. If it's only verbal, it kind of never happened, unfortunately. We're in such a litigious society these days. So do it in writing.
What about services for first steps in early childhood?
They pretty much operate the same way. So first steps, you literally can, if you can figure out who your Part C agency is in your state, you can just literally Google Part C IDEA in the name of your state, and you should land on your state's plan, their program. And if you're not sure, you can contact one of those parent training and information centers. Those are all located at www.p2pusa.org, parent-to-parent-usa.org.
Oh, okay.
So everybody should be able to locate their PTI.
Nice.
And so along with first steps and some of the early childhood, what kind of particular services can kids get through that, as far as the type of practitioners that are available?
That is a great question, and it's so hard, because technically this way the laws are written, the schools pretty much have to do whatever you can prove that the student's going to benefit from. And the problem with that is not every school district can own every profession. There aren't enough BCBAs to go around the world ever. Does every school have a BCBA? No, absolutely not. Do they all have speech pathologists? Some of them don't even have speech pathologists, and they have implementers instead.
There aren't enough paras to go around.
Exactly. Or even enough special education teachers these days.
Right.
So can we say they have to do everything? Well, we have to say they've got to do everything, but just know that may not actually come to fruition. So what is everything? It's everything we talked about in our last session. We talked about behavior analysis extensively, speech language therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy. Some other little known ones that people don't talk about very often is we can definitely ask for social skills groups. We can also ask for professional counseling. And then another one a lot of people do not know about, it's a big secret, is you can ask for parent training. And it's very important that parents and caregivers receive the same information as what's being generated at the school level so that they can all be practicing the same way, because it's about taking these skills that are developing in the school and then generalizing to the rest of that child's life. And if half of the people involved in that child's life are out of the loop on what's being done, that doesn't actually help. So parent caregiver trainer is an item that absolutely can be written into your child's IEP. I strongly recommend it.
And something I want to throw out there too with first steps, I'm going to, as you guys know, if you've been listening, I am a BCBA by trade, and something that I have encountered a lot when intaking with, new families is families in relation to ABA. Families saying, oh, we've done ABA through first steps. And ABA through first steps is very different than what your traditional ABA is going to be. And I have found that often parents are a little bit surprised by that, given that when your child is receiving, we'll call it quote unquote ABA in first steps, it may be 1 hour a week. It's heavily kind of parent training based, but it does not mimic what ABA looks like. So it's important for you to know as you start to navigate services, if you're going to navigate true ABA at a center or in-home, etc., you are going to be looking, at 10 to 40 hours a week, depending on the age and abilities of your child. Whereas first steps, somebody is coming into your home, a board certified behavior analyst is coming, directly in your home for an hour a week. So they're drastically different in what their goals and outcomes are. So just something to be on the lookout for that I've seen,
Mhm.
you know, as a director that parents seem to often be shocked by.
Right.
Oftentimes as well, that First Steps, and I should clarify too, First Steps is the name of the program in Missouri. We just call it Part C on a national level. So if you are not from
Oh,
Missouri,
yeah.
that's why it may not make sense to you. But
Mhm.
it's still, still resonates. But that is true. First Steps / Part C is really parent training based. A lot of people think I'm getting what my kid needs for therapy through First Steps, and they're really not getting what they need. They're getting a taste of what they need, and
Mhm.
they're getting some parent awareness training about the therapy itself. Sometimes it's only a parent early intervention educator that's coming to your house. There may be a BCBA on your team, but that person may not see your child very often at all, and there may not be anybody actually implementing behavior analysis.
Mhm.
So be aware that that really is more of an awareness mechanism. And if you really
Mhm.
want the full true therapy as soon as possible, you're going to need to go to a private therapist to
Right.
accomplish that, which means you do have to have an actual diagnosis. So
Right.
there's that. But do that, yeah.
And so that actually brings me to my next topic that I want to talk about today, which is the difference between a medical diagnosis versus an educational diagnosis. This is very, very important to hear about. So I want to make sure that people hear this. This is something I ran into again all the time on intake calls. There is a difference between these two. What you have heard us talk about mostly thus far, if you've been listening to our podcast, is a medical diagnosis. It was obtained through an evaluation by a qualified healthcare professional, a physician, a psychologist, a psychiatrist, etc. It meets criteria through a diagnostic statistic manual 5. It meets very specific criteria medically. A school diagnosis is an educational evaluation that is conducted by the personnel within the school or within the district. So there might be educational diagnosticians, special education teachers, school psychologists, and that's used to determine a child's eligibility for special education services or accommodations under federal and state laws through IDEA or the 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. So I know that was a mouthful, but what I want people to hear is this next part. A school diagnosis is not a medical diagnosis.
No. Nope.
Okay? So if you have a school diagnosis, that is not going to help your child get access to any services, like through their insurance, through the state,
Mhm.
etc. If they only have a school diagnosis. It is not medical. You
Right.
must have a medical diagnosis to get access to services and some of these programs that Georgia was just talking about. You have to have that medical diagnosis. And to further my rant here, the diagnostic process and the diagnostic code that is created comes from that Diagnostic Statistic Manual 5. It is medically based, as I stated, whereas for the school, it is simply a categorization, and their criteria is different. So there is also a chance, I've encountered this many times, where a child may have a medical diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, but based on the school's definition and their evaluation of a child's functioning, they do not qualify for the autism spectrum disorder categorization that the school gives. So it's very important for people to hear that these two things are not synonymous with one another.
So one of the things I like to instill in parents very early along these lines is let's start calling them a diagnosis or a categorization.
Yes.
Right.
Yep.
Do not mix the two. And the sooner you understand that, the better you're going to be able to have these conversations with the parent or with the school district when you go to your IEPs or 504s. I've got clients that have kids who weren't diagnosed till their teens or their late, tweens. And they're very frustrated having these conversations with the schools because they keep saying, but she has a diagnosis. She has a diagnosis. And I have to keep reminding them, yes, but she already had a categorization, and there's nothing about her situation that is different that would change that categorization. We have a medical diagnosis now, but she is still the same person she was when we started all of this. And they may not see her any differently because they may not see these differences, but the differences may not be educationally impacting the students, so we can't warrant changing their categorization based on a whim. And
Yeah.
that is a really hard thing to stomach, because a lot of them think, I can't believe I went to all this work and got this medical diagnosis and now nothing changes. Are you kidding? But that's, start early
Right.
and aggressively and accurately.
Awesome. And so I hope we didn't beat that like a dead horse, but it is just so important. I've just ran into
really
it so
is
many times.
Crucial,
Mhm.
really.
And so we kind of started to throw out some information, regarding what you can get when you are at a school. So let's say you have been given this diagnosis of, through the school, or excuse me, we're calling it a categorization, ladies. Okay.
Let's just change the term.
Yep, we're calling it a categorization
It's gonna be a hard
here.
turn, I'll tell you.
We're gonna trademark that. So, so you have this categorization at the school, and now what? There are two different kind of avenues of the what can come from that. So we have the IEP, the Individualized Education Plan, or the 504 plan.
Yep.
So I want to also kind of talk about some of the main differences that come with this. Georgia, can you kind of tell me too what laws are kind of related to these two before we go into depth?
Sure. So an IEP, an Individualized Education Plan, is governed by our federal IDEA, which is Individualized
Individuals with disabilities.
Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Thank you.
See, it's a bunch of acronyms.
I know.
They trip everybody up.
Yes. 504, on the other hand, as I mentioned before, Section 504 of the Americans with Disabilities Act is the educational setting version of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So, in that whole group of laws is under what's called Office for Civil Rights, OCR. The difference, I think, at the face value, the difference is Office for Civil Rights and Americans with Disabilities Act, of course, they're kind of synonymous. They are all about access. They are about the student being able to access the same thing as their peers. And access can mean a lot of things. It can be physical access. It can be cognitive access. It can actually be emotional access, for that matter. So it's about access, and it's about making accommodations in order to make sure the student can access that help. And it's also about supporting the people surrounding the student who might advocate on their behalf. And both of our categories of students are eligible to utilize the Section 504 laws. And the plan we write for them is called a 504 plan. By contrast, under IDEA, we have an IEP document, Individualized Education Plan document, and that is more about the specialized education.
Very much more specific than a 504.
Yeah.
Much so. It's more specific, and it requires that the person has some force pushing in, providing something.
Right.
It's not just about taking the barriers out of the way.
Right.
We put an accommodations section in there, which pretty much mirrors a 504 plan. And that's at the back of the document. But first and foremost, the child must require specialized education in order to be eligible for an IEP. So the things that are going on with them, the reason they qualify, have to be reasons that their education access has been negatively impacted. So when we have a student who is a straight A student, does it mean they can never have an IEP? No, but it's a whole lot harder to obtain.
Right.
It is possible, It's very hard to obtain.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of the fine line right there. It's it's either access only for the most part, or access plus specialized education.
Well, and I think just for a little clarity, because, we're throwing around 504s, we're throwing around IEPs, bear in mind your 504 is going to describe adjustments in kind of the school setting to remove barriers to the regular education in school. So maybe it's too loud in the room, so the kid is able to wear headphones. This doesn't require as much effort, right? We're just removing barriers. You hear a lot about kids maybe who are diagnosed with ADHD and they're given extra time, or they can take the test outside of the classroom. Things like that are kind of what your 504s cover.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas your IEPs, on top of removing the barriers, because they still do that, but they also provide kind of the specialized instruction and services that helps the child develop the skills that make really their disability harder on them to learn.
Nice
So-
summary, thank you.
Well, we
get
hear
a little excited sometimes.
well, we hear a lot about the two, and I know as a parent going into schools, you're confused. You don't know, does my kid need a 504 or do they need an IEP? Well, intensity really kind of pushes it in that direction.
Yeah.
Intensity and need of services.
Yeah. And especially if it's a first go round for you, you just don't know what you don't know yet. So always question.
Mm-hmm.
It's never wrong to say, I just don't understand why this is right and that's wrong, and I need to understand this better. It's never wrong to keep asking questions. And you probably will for the rest of your child's life, but all the way through their education, you'll still keep asking questions, and you should.
Okay, so we're kind of talking about the IEP services. What IEPs? What services might that IEP include specifically? I know we've talked about SLPs. We've talked about you mentioned even some help with counseling services
And social
and
skills.
and the social skills and the parent trainings. What is another benefit of an IEP? Is this something that goes with them through school?
Yes, it does. It's a cumulative document,
Mm-hmm.
and it updates and increases and changes all the time, and it's dynamic for the life of the student's career. And so that is exactly what should happen with an IEP. Other kinds of services too, though, are going to be very academically specific.
Okay.
Yeah. So, for example, I talked with Orton Gillingham reading specialist this week, and so reading. A lot of our kids have learning disabilities with reading, and they need more. And so, we have lots of great specialists in those kinds of areas. We could have somebody who specializes in dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia. So these are going to be handwriting issues, math issues, and reading issues.
Mm-hmm.
So those are all going to be education specific. You could have somebody that needs vision therapy because the way they see things is not accurate.
Right.
And so we might need to change something about how that person sees their schoolwork so they can participate. Hearing. You could have somebody who has a hearing impairment, and they may or may not have hearing aids, which we all know are kind of a nightmare. Even if you do have them, it doesn't just solve everything. So we might need that student to sit closer to the front of the room. Or we might need the teacher to wear a little microphone that shoots out a speaker through a speaker on that child's desk, an FM system. So there's lots of different kinds of specialized teaching and things like that can happen in an IEP. Kind of, if you can dream it, we can probably figure out how to do it. There really aren't a lot of barriers. Actually, I wanted to add as well that when we do an IEP, we also determine how much time that student is going to be in a general education setting. What percentage of their day is going to be a general education setting versus specialized instruction of some kind. Oh, and they could also potentially have a paraprofessional, for example. Some students really need a one-on-one. I've got a student that I'm working with who actually needs a one-on-one medical nurse. Really out there, but you never know, right?
Right.
So, but this percentage of time that child is receiving that extra help, that special education of some kind, is we add all that up and we figure out what percentage of the time is the student integrated with regular education versus segregated in some way by a specialized service. And the higher that percentage is, the less they are receiving access to general education, of course, but the less they're also receiving access to free and appropriate public education, and the more that we are getting closer to consideration of some of those alternative options.
And kind of going off that, one, thought that I had too is questions I've been asked a lot from parents about, okay, so if I don't get an IEP, can I still have a para? Can I still have a paraprofessional working with my child? The answer is no. Very unlikely. If you are looking for that one-on-one support, that is going to likely be because your child meets one of those qualifications for needing an individualized education plan. There are some medical differences, when that is at play, but as far as needing, just kind of support and within like the learning environment, that is likely going to come from your IEP,
Right.
as well. So just something to consider there, because I know the word paraprofessional gets thrown out a lot, and a lot of people go in kind of gung-ho thinking, I must need a paraprofessional. And when they don't get it, they're like devastated. But,
Right.
There is a time and a place, and there are only so many paraprofessionals that
That's
are available.
Yes, we have a shortage in our industry, and there are, you're right, there, and by definition, if the child doesn't qualify for an IEP, how would they qualify for an educational para one-on-one? One knocks the other out. There's no way that you're going to usually have both. Now, the medical, though, you touched on that. I'm going to go back to that because it is the person I'm supporting right now that has a medical, she is a nurse. She has a 504, a nurse. Wow. Unheard of. The school would really like to get out of having to do that, but they truly cannot. And so even though it's very cost prohibitive to them, it's expensive. They honestly, in this case, do not have a choice. Yeah, very unusual.
Yeah.
It's maybe the first instance I've run into where a student had a nurse and they had a 504 instead of an IEP.
Right.
Very unusual. And the parent would rather the child have an IEP too. It's not like they don't want that scenario. It just it really doesn't work out that way in this case.
In an upcoming episode, we're going to discuss maybe if school districts can't accommodate
Absolutely.
the needs,
There are times.
kind of where do we go from there? But we'll talk about that in another episode.
So it's kind of, a wrap up to this. For families that are new to kind of this diagnostic versus categorization, the IEP, the 504, etc., I want to kind of end with, like, if you're unsure, there are organizations out there that can help you from an advocating perspective understand some of this. There are, there are some like free organizations. There are also organizations that, will attend with you. And there's also private advocacy. So private educational advocacy or consultants, that can assist you in understanding this process. It's very important. I would recommend, learning about it as soon as possible. Instead of trying to just, I hear a lot of, well, we're just going to see how this goes and we'll kind of go from there. Well, what's hard is we don't know what we don't know. So it's really hard for a parent that doesn't have, all of the background knowledge to say, yeah, I feel like this is a good, this is a good route, or I feel like this categorization by the school was accurate. They really have to have some background knowledge to know whether or not what they were given is accurate, good, etc. So find advocates, learn about the process, and there's many different avenues that you can go to do so.
Yeah, network, for sure. Well, thank you for joining us on this exceptional journey. Click the subscribe button and share with your friends. We'll see you next week when we discuss educational options.